She rode into Black Hollow with one trunk, a signed contract, and the quiet belief that a fresh start was still possible for a woman like her. What she got instead was a crowd of strangers laughing at her name, a man who said she wasn't worth the paper the contract was printed on, and a cattle baron who had arranged the whole thing just to watch someone else burn. Evelyn Ashcroft had traveled 400 miles to be a bride. She ended up being something nobody in that town saw coming. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Like and stay with me until the end. This one's worth it. The morning stage from Caldwell came in 40 minutes late, which meant the crowd waiting outside Harlan's Feed and Dry Goods had been standing in the October wind long enough to get mean about it. There were maybe 30 people gathered along the main street of Black Hollow, Wyoming. Not because anyone had announced a welcome, but because small towns survive on spectacle, and word travels faster than any stagecoach. Someone had told someone who had told someone else that Rhett Calloway's mail-order bride was arriving on the Tuesday stage, and in a town this size, that was enough. Rhett Calloway himself stood apart from the crowd, one shoulder resting against the post of the livery stable, arms folded, hat pulled low. He wasn't smiling. He hadn't been smiling about much of anything for the past 8 months, since the drought cracked his eastern pastures and 2 of his best hands quit for the silver mines in Nevada. He'd sent the letter to the Hartwell Placement Agency in April more out of exhaustion than hope, not looking for romance, just someone who knew how to run a household and maybe keep a set of ledgers without making him feel like an idiot when he asked questions. The agency wrote back in June. By September, they'd matched him with a woman named Evelyn Ashcroft from outside Lawrence, Kansas. He hadn't told anyone until 3 weeks ago. He wished, standing there now, that he had kept it to himself even longer. The stage lurched around the bend at the top of Sutter's Grade and came rolling down the main drag in a cloud of trail dust and creaking leather. The driver hauled back on the reins in front of the post office, and the horses stomped and blew and shook their heads like they were personally insulted by the whole trip. The door swung open. She stepped down without waiting for the driver's help. Evelyn Ashcroft was 30 years old, though she looked older in the way that women who've worked outside most of their lives tend to look older. Not worn out exactly, but settled, like she'd already made peace with certain things most people were still arguing about. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men on the street, but she had a kind of plain steadiness to her face that some people find more interesting than beauty after the first 5 minutes. Her dress was clean but had been mended at the left sleeve. Her trunk, which the driver dropped down from the rack with considerably less care than it deserved, was strapped with 2 different kinds of rope. She stood there for a moment, getting her land legs back, and looked down the street with the careful expression of someone trying to form an honest opinion before speaking. Then she saw the crowd, and the crowd saw her. The first laugh came from somewhere to the left, a short, ugly sound, like someone had tried to turn a cough into something crueler. Then a whisper moved through the gathered people the way a cold draft moves through a poorly sealed room, touching everything. Evelyn did not look away. She picked up her travel bag, checked that her trunk hadn't split on landing, and started walking toward the post office to ask where she might find Rhett Calloway. She didn't get far. A man stepped out of the crowd and planted himself in her path. He was tall, well over 6 feet, wearing a wool coat that cost more than most people in Black Hollow made in 2 months. His boots were clean in the way that boots only stay clean when the man wearing them never does his own walking. He had a wide face, the kind that photographs well, and pale eyes that communicated nothing useful about the person behind them. Gideon Voss. Half the county's grazing land, all of the county's patience for anyone who got in his way. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, which meant he had rehearsed the volume. "I hope the journey wasn't too uncomfortable." Evelyn stopped. "It was fine, thank you." "Good." He smiled, and the smile did not go anywhere near his eyes. "I want you to know, before you take another step in this town, that I've seen the contract you signed with the Hartwell Agency." He paused for effect, the way men who are accustomed to audiences do. "The whole arrangement is fraudulent. The agency operates without proper territorial licensing. That contract isn't worth the ink on it." The whispers got louder. Evelyn's expression did not change. "I wasn't aware of any licensing issue." "Of course you weren't. You were told what they needed you to believe." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, held it up so the crowd could see it, though nobody in the crowd was close enough to read a word. "Mr. Calloway's situation is Let's say it honestly, not what was represented to you. Iron Creek Ranch is months from foreclosure. The man cannot pay his hands, cannot service his debt, and cannot feed his remaining cattle through winter. He folded the document again and tucked it away with the practiced ease of someone performing a card trick. The charitable thing, for everyone involved, is for you to get back on that stage and let us sort this out among ourselves. There was a beat of silence that felt heavier than it should have. Then someone in the crowd, Evelyn never saw who, said, clear enough to hear, he can't even afford a real woman, had to order one from a catalog. The laughter was broader this time, more comfortable, the kind of laughter that gets easier once someone else starts it. Evelyn felt the heat rise in her face, and she hated that, because she'd spent a long time training herself out of visible reactions. She stood still, her bag in one hand, the October wind pulling at her hair, and she looked at Gideon Voss with an expression that was not anger, not yet, but something quieter and more durable than anger. "Where," she said, "is Rhett Calloway?" Someone pointed. She turned and looked toward the livery stable, and there he was, still leaning on the post, still with his arms folded, but standing upright now, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. He was maybe 40, lean in the way that ranch work makes a man lean, with a week's worth of beard that wasn't entirely intentional, and the particular kind of stillness that comes from having spent a lot of time outdoors and not a lot of time in rooms. He pushed off the post and walked toward her. The crowd shifted slightly to let him through. He stopped in front of her and looked her over. Not rudely, but with the frank assessment of a man who didn't have the luxury of being polite about things that mattered. "Miss Ashcroft." "Mr. Calloway." There was a pause that contained several different conversations neither of them was ready to have. "I should have been at the post office," he said. "I'm sorry about that." "It's fine." It wasn't entirely fine, but she let it go. "Is what he said true? About the ranch?" Rhett glanced over at Gideon, who was watching from a careful distance with that same manufactured smile, then looked back at Evelyn. Something moved through his expression. Not shame, exactly, but a close relative of it. "Which part?" he said. "The foreclosure part." He exhaled slowly through his nose. "It's not as far along as he made it sound, but it's not good." He paused. "I probably should have told you more about the situation before now. That's on me." "You should have." She said it without venom, just as a fact. "What about the agency, the contract?" "I don't know what he's saying about licensing. I paid the agency fee. The paperwork seemed in order to me." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll admit I didn't investigate it as carefully as I maybe should have." Gideon's voice carried over from his position. "Miss Ashcroft, the next southbound stage leaves Thursday morning. I'd be happy to cover the fare back to Kansas as a gesture of goodwill toward a woman in an unfortunate situation." Several people in this crowd nodded, which told Evelyn something about how much of this town was in Gideon Voss's pocket, even if they didn't know it yet. She turned and looked at Gideon directly. "That's very generous," she said. Her voice was calm enough to be unsettling. "But I haven't seen the ranch yet." "I just explained—" "You explained what you've decided I should know." She picked up her travel bag again, the one she'd set down when all of this started. "I'd like to see the actual place." The crowd had gone quiet in the specific way that crowds go quiet when something unexpected happens. Gideon's smile thinned at the edges. "You'd be wasting your time, Miss Ashcroft." "Then I'll waste it." She looked at Rhett. "Is there room on your wagon for my trunk?" He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression that had been closed shifted very slightly open. "Yeah," he said. "There's room." The wagon road to Iron Creek Ranch took 40 minutes through country that was mostly honest about what it was. Scrub grass, rolling tableland, the occasional cottonwood along the creek beds, the whole thing bleached out and exhausted looking under the flat October sky. Evelyn sat on the bench beside Rhett and watched the landscape go past and didn't say much. Neither did he. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, which surprised her. She'd expected awkwardness or apology or some variety of performative explanation. Instead, Rhett drove the way men drive when they're thinking about something they haven't solved yet. Focused, unhurried, occasionally adjusting the reins for no reason that was visible to anyone else. About 20 minutes out of town, he said, "I should probably explain the actual situation before we get there." "That would help, yes." He talked for the rest of the drive. He didn't dress it up. Iron Creek had been a working cattle operation for 11 years. His father had started it and built it to respectable size, and then his father had died 4 years ago, leaving debts that Rhett had spent the next 2 years paying down. He'd gotten close. Then the drought hit. Not a catastrophic drought, not the kind that kills everything, but the slow grinding kind that just keeps taking. Pasture after pasture went dry. He'd sold cattle at bad prices to make debt payments, which left him with fewer animals to sell next season, which made the debt payments harder. The bank held a note that came due in full by the end of March. The annual cattle auction in November was supposed to be the thing that saved him, but the herd was in poor enough shape that he was worried about what they'd fetch. "How many cattle?" Evelyn asked. 63 head that are auction-worthy, maybe. 22 that I'm not sure about." He paused. "And a bull that's been off his feed for 6 weeks." She absorbed this. "What's wrong with the bull?" "I don't know." "Has anyone looked at him?" Sheriff Pruitt's nephew claims to know something about livestock medicine. He came out and said the bull was depressed. Evelyn looked at him. "I know," Rhett said. "What are you feeding the 22 uncertain cattle?" "Same as the others. Hay from the east barn. Some supplemental grain when we can afford it." "Where do they graze?" "Northwest pasture, mostly." She filed this away without comment. Through the window of the wagon seat, she could see a ridge of hills to the north, brown and close-cropped, and below them the first visible structures of a ranch. A main house, a long, low barn, several outbuildings, fencing that ran in multiple directions. "Who else knows how bad it is?" she asked. "My hands." 3 men. Decker, Santos, and a kid named Foley, who's 17 and works for room and board, and now apparently half of Black Hollow, since Voss seems to make it his business. "Why does Voss want your ranch?" Rhett was quiet for a moment. The wagon went over a rut, and both of them absorbed it. Iron Creek sits on the only reliable creek crossing between his northern range and the southern grazing land he's been buying up. If he owns this property, he controls water access for 300 square miles of territory. He paused. "He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years. I keep saying no." Evelyn thought about the way Gideon Voss had smiled when he said the contract was fraudulent. The pleasure in it. The preparation. "He arranged this," she said. "The humiliation at the station. Probably. He wanted me to get back on the stage. Probably. Why?" Rhett glanced at her sideways. "I think he figured that if you showed up and the situation was as bad as he described, and he made it worse in public, you'd leave and I'd have nothing left to hold on to." He paused. "I've been holding on by my fingernails for 8 months. Having someone else come in was the first thing that felt like maybe things could change." He said it flatly, without sentiment, like he was reporting a fact about the weather. Voss is smart enough to know that sometimes what breaks a person isn't the big thing. It's just one more small thing that doesn't come through. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house. Evelyn looked at the property for the first time. The house was a 2-story frame structure that had been painted white at some point, and was now the color of old cream, peeling at the corners, one shutter hanging slightly wrong. The porch had a good rail and solid boards, but needed sweeping. Beside the house, a kitchen garden had gone mostly to seed. She could see the dried stalks of summer vegetables, a few things that might have been squash, a rosemary plant that had somehow survived everything. The barn was large and listed to the left in a way that might have been structural, or might have been an optical illusion. The fencing she could see from here was functional but not maintained. Wire loose in 2 spots she could already identify, posts tilted in a third. It was not a disaster. It was a place that had been managed by someone with too much to do and not enough people to help with it. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting. The 3 hands came out of the barn slowly, with the energy of men who had been working hard enough to resent being interrupted, but not so hard that they couldn't take a break. Decker was the oldest, 50 or so, stiff in one knee, with a face like weathered boot leather, and the general expression of a man who had made his opinion about mail-order brides known before she arrived. Santos was younger, compact, with careful dark eyes that moved from Evelyn to Rhett and back again without committing to anything. Foley was 17, just as Rhett had said, with the gangly proportions of someone who'd grown too fast and hadn't caught up to himself yet. "This is Miss Ashcroft," Rhett said. Decker looked at her like she was a piece of livestock he'd been asked to evaluate and had already decided wasn't worth the purchase price. He didn't say anything. Santos nodded once. Foley said ma'am, and then looked immediately at his boots. I'd like to see the cattle, Evelyn said, particularly the ones in the northwest pasture and the bull. Is he in the barn? Decker turned to Rhett. She know anything about cattle, or are we doing a tour? I don't know yet, Rhett said. Was Evelyn thought at least an honest answer. She spent the rest of the afternoon looking at things. She walked the northwest pasture first, following the fence line to its far corner, studying the grass, or what passed for grass after a dry summer. She noticed that the pasture's drainage was poor. Water would pool in the low center section and then dry out in a hard crust that cattle hooves couldn't break through to reach what little green was underneath. The hay they were eating was stored in the east barn, which she inspected next. It wasn't bad hay, but it wasn't good hay either. Cut late, stored slightly damp, the kind of feed that keeps animals alive without giving them much to work with. The bull was in the third stall from the end. His name, according to the hand-painted board above the stall, was Atticus, which told Evelyn something about whoever had named him. He was a big Hereford, dark red with a white face, and he was standing with his head low and his ears slightly back, eating without enthusiasm. She stood outside the stall for a few minutes, watching him. He looked at her once, with the bored, suffering expression of an animal that has been unwell for long enough to accept it. She went back outside, found Rhett leaning against the fence watching Santos move some cattle across the yard, and said, "When did you change the northwest pasture rotation?" He looked at her. "About 3 months ago, when the southeast pasture dried up. The drainage in the northwest low section is creating a mineral-deficient patch. The cattle grazing that section are probably short on zinc and selenium." She paused. "That's also likely what's wrong with the bull. He's been grazing that section?" "Mostly, yeah." "It's not complicated to fix. You'd need to move him to the east pasture for a few weeks and supplement his feed. The others too, the uncertain ones." She paused. "It won't solve everything, but it'll help." Rhett was watching her with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and wary, like a man who has been offered something he wants very much but doesn't yet trust the offer. "How do you know that?" "I grew up on a ranch outside Lawrence, smaller than this one." She looked out across the yard. "My father got sick when I was 15. I ran most of the operation for 4 years before we sold it." She said it like it was a simple fact, which it was. "I know what mineral deficiency looks like in cattle." The silence between them had a different quality now. Decker had drifted within earshot during this exchange. He said without looking at her, "Anybody can say they know something." "That's true," Evelyn said. "I guess we'll see." Rhett showed her the house that evening. The inside was cleaner than the outside suggested. Not spotlessly clean, but the kind of clean that comes from a single person doing their best in too many rooms. The kitchen had a good iron stove and a well-organized pantry that told her more about Rhett than almost anything he'd said so far. A man who maintains a pantry with that level of care, even when everything else is falling apart, is a man who has not given up. He showed her the downstairs bedroom, his father's old room, empty since he'd died, and said she could have it. His own room was upstairs. The arrangement was practical and, she thought, somewhat deliberate. The space between them was being established carefully by a man who was not sure how to handle this situation with any grace. "I want to be honest with you," he said, standing in the doorway while she set her bag down on the bed. "I don't know exactly what this is. The contract thing. I don't know if Voss is right about the licensing. I'll look into it. But even if the paperwork turns out to be in order, I'm not—" He stopped and started again. "I'm not expecting anything from you except what you're willing to give. If you want to leave after a week, I'll understand it." She looked at him. "Do you want me to leave?" He considered this more carefully than most men would have. "No," he said finally. "I think you might be useful, and I think—" Another pause. "I think you're the kind of person who doesn't scare easily. This ranch needs that more than it needs almost anything else right now." "Useful," she said. "That's honest, at least." "I'm not good at the other kind of honest, the kind with better words." "I'm not much interested in better words," she said. "I've had enough of those to last me." She looked around the room, the faded quilt on the bed, the single window that looked out toward the east pasture, the smell of old wood and cold, and somewhere underneath it something that might have been cedar. "I'll stay," she said. "For now." Rhett nodded. He didn't smile, but something in the set of his shoulders changed. "Supper's at 6, he said. "Decker cooks on Tuesdays. I'll warn you, it's usually not good." "I'll cook," she said. "I need to see what's in the pantry anyway." He left her to it. She stood alone in the room for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. The distant low of cattle, the wind coming down from the north, the creak of the house adjusting to the cold. She'd come 400 miles for a fresh start. It looked like what she'd gotten instead was a fight. She found to her own mild surprise that she wasn't particularly sorry about that. Look, the next morning she was up before light. She rebuilt the kitchen fire, found coffee and the makings of a decent breakfast, and had everything on the table by the time Rhett came downstairs with his boots in his hand, and the expression of a man who had expected to be the first one awake. He sat down, looked at the food, and looked at her. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." She sat across from him with her own coffee. "I want to move the bull today, and the 22 uncertain cattle. I also want to look at the east pasture fence. There are 2 sections that are losing tension. If those go in a hard wind, you'll be chasing cattle for a week." He drank his coffee. "Decker's not going to like you telling him what to do." "Decker doesn't have to like it. He just has to do it." She paused. "Unless you're going to tell me I shouldn't." Rhett looked at her for a moment over his cup. "No, I'm not going to tell you that." Foley appeared at the back door, stamping his feet, and stopped when he saw the breakfast on the table with genuine surprise. "That's," he said, then seemed to remember his manners. "Good morning, ma'am." "Sit down," she said. "Eat. I need you to show me where the southwest pasture gate is after breakfast. The one that doesn't latch right." "How do you know about that gate?" "I walked the fence line yesterday afternoon. It's the 3rd one from the creek." Foley sat down and started eating with the focused efficiency of a 17-year-old who is always hungry. He looked up at her after a moment with something in his expression that was not yet trust, but was at least curiosity, which she'd learned was the thing that comes before trust in most people worth knowing. Decker and Santos came in together. Decker saw the breakfast, saw Evelyn sitting at the head of the table. Not the actual head, just the side closest to the stove. But Decker seemed to process it as the head. And his expression went the particular way it goes when a man has decided to be difficult about something that isn't really about the thing he's being difficult about. He sat down without a word and started eating. Santos said, "This is good, Miss Ashcroft, thank you." Decker chewed, then said, without looking at her, "I've been managing the northwest pasture rotation since before you got here." "I know," she said. "The rotation was the right call when the southeast pasture dried up. The drainage problem in the low section is just bad luck. Nobody would have caught it without looking specifically for it." He glanced at her then, just quickly. "The 22 cattle in that section," she continued, "are probably going to recover once we move them and adjust their supplemental feed. I'd like to do that today if possible, before the weather changes." She looked out the window, where the sky had the heavy pearl gray look of incoming weather. "That storm front that's been building to the northwest is going to arrive by tomorrow evening. Wet and cold. Better to have the animals where we want them before it hits." Decker looked at Rhett. Rhett was eating his breakfast. "She's right about the storm," Santos said quietly. Decker went back to eating. He didn't agree out loud, but he also didn't argue. That, Evelyn had learned a long time ago, was about as close to a yes as some people could manage. Outside, the wind was picking up from the northwest, carrying the first real cold of the season with it. The cattle in the near pasture moved together instinctively, the way cattle do when they sense a change coming. Evelyn looked at them through the kitchen window and thought about what she had to work with. 63 head for auction, 22 to recover, 1 bull to bring back, 3 men who ranged from actively hostile to cautiously neutral, a ranch that was either going to survive the winter or it wasn't. And a man across the breakfast table who was watching her the way people watch something they haven't decided whether to trust, but are beginning to think they might. She picked up her coffee cup. "After we move the cattle," she said, "I want to look at the hay storage in the north barn. If what you have in there is the same quality as the east barn, we might be able to stretch the supply by changing the feeding schedule." Rhett set down his cup. "You mean feed them less?" "I mean feed them smarter. There's a difference." She met his eyes. "Trust me." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. It was not a declaration of anything. It was just 2 words from a man who didn't use them carelessly. Outside, the wind came down hard off the north ridge and moved through the dry grass of the pasture like something with a purpose. The ranch was still standing. For now, that was enough. The storm arrived a full 6 hours earlier than the sky had promised. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. The wind was coming in hard sideways gusts that flattened the dry grass and sent the chickens scrambling under the porch, and the first sleet was ticking against the barn windows like gravel thrown by an impatient hand. Evelyn was in the north barn with Foley, working through the hay inventory when the weather turned serious. "That's going to freeze overnight," Foley said, looking out through the gap in the barn doors at the darkening sky. "Yes." She was moving through the hay stacks methodically, pulling samples from different sections, checking moisture content by feel the way her father had taught her. A fistful of hay pressed hard, then released. If it clumped and stayed clumped, it was storing damp. Most of what she was finding in the back sections was doing exactly that. "Problem?" Foley asked, watching her. "About a third of this is poor quality. You can feed it, but you're not getting the nutritional value you think you're getting." She stacked the samples she'd set aside. "Where does Mr. Calloway buy his hay?" "Mostly Bauer's operation, over past Ridgeline Creek. Sometimes from the Tilton brothers, if Bauer's short." "What does he pay?" Foley told her. She did the arithmetic in her head. "He's paying Bauer prices for Tilton quality on at least some of this. Either Bauer is cutting corners on what he delivers, or someone isn't checking the loads when they come in." Foley was quiet for a moment. "Decker handles the hay deliveries." Evelyn didn't say anything to that. She made a mental note and moved on. By the time they got back to the house, Rhett and Santos had finished moving the 22 uncertain cattle to the east pasture, and Decker had gotten the bull Atticus relocated to a smaller pen near the main barn where the ground was drier and the wind broke against the south wall. Nobody had asked Decker twice. Whether that was because he'd decided Evelyn was worth listening to, or simply because the storm was coming and there wasn't time for argument, she couldn't tell yet. Supper that night was crowded and loud in the small way that a ranch kitchen gets when 5 people are trying to warm up after cold work. Santos had brought in extra wood without being asked. Foley had fed the horses and double-checked the pasture gates, and reported back with the earnest thoroughness of someone who was starting to enjoy having tasks assigned with a clear purpose behind them. Decker sat at the far end of the table and ate without looking at anyone, which Evelyn had started to understand was simply how he occupied space, not necessarily hostility in any active sense. Rhett watched all of it without saying much. After the hands had gone out to the bunkhouse and the kitchen had settled into the particular quiet that comes after a meal, he sat at the table with a second cup of coffee and the account ledger he brought out most evenings like a man returning to a wound he couldn't stop checking. "The hay problem," he said without looking up. Decker should have caught that. Possibly. Or he knew and didn't mention it because he didn't want to create a problem with Bauer. She sat across from him, her own coffee in hand. "Either way, it's fixable. We change how we're feeding the weaker animals, smaller amounts, more frequently. Mix in what good hay we have with the poor stuff, so they're still getting some nutritional value. Stretch the supply and get more from it." He was quiet for a moment, his finger tracing a column of numbers that clearly did not add up to what he needed them to. "We have 11 weeks until the auction," he said. "I know. 63 head that need to come in looking worth buying." "I know that too." He finally looked up. "I'm not—" He stopped. Tried again. "I've been running this place alone for 4 years. I know what I don't know. I'm just not used to anyone else being here to point it out. I'm not pointing it out to embarrass you. I know you're not. That's actually the part that's harder to get used to." He rubbed a hand over his face, the gesture of a tired man who has been tired for long enough that it's become his resting state. "What else did you find today that you haven't told me yet?" She considered lying, or softening it, and decided against both. "The southwest fence section near the creek crossing needs more than tightening. 2 posts are rotted at the base. They'll pull out of the ground in a hard wind. We're also losing water from the stock tank in the east pasture. There's a slow leak at the inlet pipe. And your grain storage has some moisture intrusion in the southeast corner. It's not critical yet, but it will be by January if nobody deals with it." Rhett stared at her. "How long were you walking around yesterday?" "Until dark." He let out a slow breath that was not quite a laugh but was in the same neighborhood. "All right. We can prioritize. The posts and the tank first because those affect the cattle directly. The grain storage can wait a week." Decker's going to say he already knew about the posts. Maybe he did. Doesn't bother you that he's not going to give you an inch? She looked at her coffee. I've met a lot of Deckers. The ones who are actually good at their work come around eventually, once they decide you're not trying to replace them. She paused. He's good at his work. I can see that. He keeps this operation from completely falling apart with very little help and very limited resources. He just doesn't like being shown something he missed. Rhett considered this. That's a more generous read of him than he's giving you. I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it because the ranch needs everyone working in the same direction. Outside, the sleet had turned to snow. She could hear the change in the sound against the kitchen window, the hard ticking replaced by something softer and more purposeful. Through the glass, the yard was disappearing under white. Rhett looked at the ledger again, then closed it. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. She stood up. It was long today. Yeah. He paused, his hand on the ledger cover. You did good today, Miss Ashcroft. She looked at him. He was not looking at her, which somehow made it feel more sincere than if he had been. Evelyn, she said. Miss Ashcroft is what strangers call me. He nodded once. Evelyn. She went to bed and listened to the snow and thought about 63 cattle and 11 weeks and a man with a ledger full of numbers that didn't add up yet. The week that followed was the kind of week that either breaks a working arrangement or settles it. Evelyn was up before dawn every morning, not to prove anything. She'd stopped needing to prove things to herself around the time she turned 26 and realized nobody was keeping score, but because there was genuinely too much to do and the days were getting shorter. She worked alongside whoever was available, which meant Santos most often, since he fell into a steady rhythm of work without needing much direction, and had the useful quality of not talking unless he had something worth saying, fully orbited her like a planet that had found an unexpected gravitational pull. He started showing up wherever she was working, initially just watching, then asking questions, then anticipating what she'd need next. By the fourth day, she found herself relying on him in the small, specific ways that add up to something. She taught him how to check the cattle for the signs of mineral deficiency, the rough coat, the slow response, the dull eyes, and he took to it with the intensity of someone who had been waiting for something concrete to learn. My dad was a farrier, he told her one morning, while they were moving the uncertain cattle to their new supplemental feeding area. He wanted me to learn it, but I don't know. I wanted to do something bigger, stupider idea than I thought at the time. Where's your dad now? Pueblo, Colorado, I think. A pause that had some complicated weather in it. We don't really talk. She didn't push on that. You're good with the animals. You have a quiet way about you that they respond to. He looked at the cattle rather than at her, but she could see the effect of it in his posture. Decker says I'm too slow, he said. Decker says that because he's watching for speed. Speed matters sometimes, but with sick animals, quiet matters more. She latched the gate to the supplemental pen. You can be fast and quiet. Takes practice. Fully thought about this like a boy storing something away for later. Decker, meanwhile, was doing what Decker did, which was work hard and say little and watch Evelyn with the sideways attention of a man waiting for her to make a mistake he could use. She didn't avoid him or try to win him over with extra effort. She just worked, and when something crossed into his territory, the equipment maintenance, the hay deliveries, the bunkhouse schedule, she went through him rather than around him, asked his opinion on things she already had an opinion about, and listened to his answers with genuine attention, because even when she disagreed with his conclusions, his reasoning was usually built on real experience. After 5 days of this, he came to her while she was checking Atticus in his pen. The bull was looking better, not dramatically better, not the kind of better you'd make into a story, but his head was higher, and he'd finished his feed that morning rather than leaving half of it. She was noting this in the small record book she'd started keeping when Decker appeared at the gate and stood there in the particular way men stand when they want to say something but haven't committed to saying it yet. She waited. The post supplier in Ridgeline Creek, he said finally. Price went up in September. I've been stretching what we have rather than spending on new stock. She looked at him. He was looking at Atticus. I would have done the same thing, she said. I know you think the posts should have been replaced. I think the posts need to be replaced now. I don't think you were wrong to wait as long as you could. A pause. Atticus snorted softly at something in the far corner of his pen. Bull's looking better, Decker said.
He is. You were right about the zinc thing. It was a reasonable guess. It worked out. He was quiet for another moment. Santos says you know what you're doing. Santos is polite.
Santos isn't polite. Santos just says what he thinks. He finally looked at her directly, with the assessing expression he'd been wearing since the day she arrived. Except this time there was less hostility in it and more something else, a kind of reluctant recalibration. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who needed looking after. Lots of people do, she said, without offense. I just don't happen to be one of them. He looked at the bull for another moment, then pushed off the gate and went back to his work without another word. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a declaration of anything, but it was, she thought, a shift. Small and real. Market. By the end of the second week, the results were visible enough that nobody was arguing about them. 4 of the 22 uncertain cattle had moved from the uncertain column to the auction-worthy column, with more likely to follow. Atticus was eating normally and had started showing interest in the world beyond his pen, which Santos said was a good sign, and Foley verified by spending 20 minutes looking it up in a veterinary reference book he'd apparently been hiding in the bunkhouse for 2 years without admitting he owned it. The east pasture fence had been repaired. The stock tank leak had been patched, badly at first, then properly when Evelyn found a fitting in the supply shed that nobody had known was there. The hay feeding schedule had been restructured, and while nobody liked the change to twice-daily smaller portions, the calves in particular were responding to it in ways that were visible even to Decker. Rhett said very little about any of it, but he'd stopped bringing the ledger out at night with the expression of a man reading a death warrant. He brought it out now with something more like caution, still worried, but worried about specific things rather than everything at once. One evening, he spread a territorial map on the kitchen table and showed her what he was up against at the auction. Voss has 3 buyers he uses, Harwell, Karp, and a man named Tooley who comes up from Cheyenne. Between them, they control about 70% of the serious purchasing power at the Black Hollow Autumn auction. He traced the names on the map margin where he'd written them. Last year, they coordinated to keep prices artificially low on 3 ranches they wanted to pressure. All 3 ended up selling to Voss within 6 months. Evelyn looked at the map. What's stopping the other buyers from competing? Voss has the feed supply contract for the Eastern District. If a buyer crosses him, their transport costs go up. He doesn't do it, obviously. He just makes sure certain people find things more difficult. Rhett leaned back. He runs the whole operation like a machine. Everything connected to everything else. Except, she said slowly, everything connected to everything else also means that if one piece fails, the pressure distributes. He looked at her. He built the machine to work when everyone stays in their lane. If someone doesn't stay in their lane, the whole interconnected thing has to respond. She paused. Who at the auction is genuinely independent of him? Someone with their own supply lines, their own transport, enough standing that Voss can't squeeze them without it becoming visible? Rhett thought for a moment. Hartley Birch runs a commercial operation out of Laramie. He doesn't like Voss. They had a dispute over water rights about 4 years back. He's never been part of the coordinated bidding. Then we need Hartley Birch to see our cattle before the auction. He doesn't do private previews. He will if we invite him properly. She met Rhett's eyes. Not as a favor, as a business proposition. He gets first access to the strongest animals, an honest evaluation of the herd, and the chance to open the bidding before Voss's buyers can set the floor. She paused. Most independent buyers would rather win a fair auction than watch Voss's people control the room. He just needs to see that there's something worth winning. Rhett stared at the map, then at her. You've been thinking about this since you got here. I've been thinking about it since Black Hollow, she said. Since I watched the way Voss performed in front of that crowd. He didn't come to humiliate you. He came to take something away from you before the auction, which means he's more worried about Iron Creek than he's letting on. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the night wind came down off the north ridge and moved across the yard. Why would he be worried? Rhett said. Before you got here, the herd was... Before I got here, you were alone. She said it plainly, not harshly. One person can only see what one person can see. Voss knew that. He's been counting on it. Rhett looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has had his own situation explained to him in a way he hadn't been able to manage himself. I'll write to Hartley Birch, he said. Good. He might not come. He might not. But we ask. She started clearing the map from the table, and he helped her without discussion, folding the corners carefully, which told her something about how he treated things he valued. They worked in the easy, slightly awkward way of two people who have not yet established the full grammar of sharing a space, who still occasionally reach for the same thing and step back from it at the same moment. You should know, he said, as she put the map away, that Voss isn't going to stop. Whatever he tried in town, that was just the opening. I know. It's going to get harder. I know that too. She looked at him directly. Are you trying to warn me off? He shook his head. Not quickly, with the deliberateness of a man who is being careful to mean what he says. No, I'm trying to tell you what you're staying for, so it's a real choice. She thought about the 400 miles and the trunk and the platform in Black Hollow and the laughter and all the versions of this moment she might have been standing in instead if different choices had been made along the way. It's a real choice, she said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else and decided against it, which she was starting to recognize as a characteristic pattern, the thought that gets 3/4 of the way to being said and then retreats to somewhere safer. She let it go. There was time. Maybe. And there was work to do first, which was always the more honest starting point anyway. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the ranch sounds. The cattle settling, the wind on the north side of the house, the faint creak of Rhett's floor above her as he moved to his own room. The uncertain cattle were getting stronger. The bull was eating. The fence held. Somewhere out past Ridgeline Creek, Gideon Voss was sitting in a warm house that cost more than this entire ranch, looking at a map that had Iron Creek marked on it, rethinking a plan that was supposed to have been finished by now. She hoped he was uncomfortable about it. She suspected he was. Hartley Birch wrote back in 9 days. The letter was short, the handwriting blunt and slightly impatient, which matched what Rhett had said about the man. He would come to Iron Creek on the Saturday before the auction to look at the herd. He was not making any commitments. He was not interested in being sold to. He would see what he saw and make his own judgment, and if Rhett's cattle were worth his time, they'd talk numbers. If they weren't, they wouldn't. Rhett read the letter twice and handed it to Evelyn without comment. That's a yes, she said. That's a conditional, maybe. From Hartley Birch? That's a yes. He looked at her. Ask Santos. He's dealt with Birch before. Santos, when asked, confirmed this. Birch doesn't come to look at things he isn't interested in buying. He just doesn't write back. So they had 12 days to get the herd ready for the most important set of eyes that would see them before the auction. 12 days to close the gap between what Iron Creek's cattle currently were and what they needed to appear to be, which was not, Evelyn was careful to clarify, a matter of deception, but of presentation. Healthy animals that looked healthy, strong animals that moved like strong animals. The difference between a buyer seeing potential and a buyer seeing problems was often nothing more than whether the problems were fixed before the viewing or after. She pushed the pace, not recklessly, there was no margin for injury or setback, but with the focused efficiency of someone who had done the math and knew exactly how little time was available. The supplemental feeding for the recovering cattle was adjusted again. She started walking the herd daily, the way her father had walked his, identifying each animal not just as a number, but as a specific creature with specific characteristics, so that she could track subtle changes that didn't show up in the aggregate. Foley shadowed her so consistently through this period that Decker started calling him her assistant, which Foley took as a slight, and Evelyn told him to take as a job title. There's no shame in learning from someone who knows more than you, she told him, on a cold morning when they were checking the cattle in the east pasture, and his breath was making small clouds in the air. The shame would be in not learning. Decker learned everything from his father, Foley said. He thinks that's the only way to know something real. Decker's father sounds like he was good at his work, but Decker also knows things his father never taught him, because he paid attention for 40 years. That's still learning. He just doesn't call it that. Foley considered this while they moved through the herd, checking ears and eyes and gait with the methodical patience she'd been working to instill in him. Do you think we'll make it? He asked. The auction. She looked out across the east pasture where the cattle were moving in the early morning light with a steadiness that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. I think we have a real chance. 3 weeks ago, I wasn't sure.
That's not a yes. No, it's not. He nodded like someone absorbing honest information for the first time and finding it strangely more reassuring than reassurance.
The Saturday of Birch's visit arrived cold and bright, the kind of November morning where the sky is an almost offensive blue and the frost on the grass catches the early light and makes everything look sharper than it really is. Birch arrived in a good wagon with a hired man beside him, both of them dressed practically, neither of them interested in small talk. He was maybe 65, built like a man who had spent his life doing physical work and still hadn't stopped, with white hair cut close and a face that held its expressions carefully. He shook Rhett's hand, looked at Evelyn with a brief, frank assessment, and said, "You're the woman from Kansas." "That's right." Word gets around. He said it without judgment, which she appreciated. "Show me the cattle." They spent 2 hours walking the herd. Birch didn't say much while he looked, which was fine, because what he was doing didn't require conversation. He moved through the animals with the practiced efficiency of a man who had evaluated thousands of cattle and could process what he was seeing at a speed that would look like indifference to someone who didn't know what they were watching. He checked teeth, ran his hands along flanks, watched the way individual animals tracked movement, and held their weight. When they reached the east pasture and the animals that had been uncertain 3 weeks ago, he stopped for a longer time. "These ones had something wrong with them," he said. It was not a question. "Mineral deficiency from poor pasture rotation," Evelyn said. "They've been on a corrected feeding program for 3 weeks." "How many?" "Started with 22. 18 are auction ready now. The other 4 need another 2 weeks." "Which 4?" She pointed them out. He looked at them. "You're probably right about the 2 weeks," he said, in a tone that didn't offer praise but didn't withhold it either. He looked at Atticus last. The bull stood in his pen with his head up, ears forward, watching the strangers with a wary attention that was completely different from the exhausted indifference of a month ago. Birch stood at the pen gate for a long time. "Hereford?" "Yes," Rhett said. "Good bone structure. He went off for a while?" 6 weeks. He's back now." Not a question this time. He stepped back from the pen. "All right, let's talk numbers." They sat in the kitchen, which had become the place where serious things were decided at Iron Creek, and Birch named a floor price per head that was 15% higher than what Rhett had been hoping for. He was clear that it was a floor, not a ceiling. He would bid at auction, not in advance, because he didn't make private deals that cut other buyers out. But he would be present, and he would be bidding seriously. "Voss is going to be there," Rhett said. Birch's expression changed in a small but distinct way. "I know. He'll have Harwell and Carp working the floor for him." "He always does." Birch looked at his coffee cup. "I've been watching Voss work his way through the southern ranches for 2 years. I've bid against his buyers before. Sometimes I win, sometimes I don't." He paused. "But I'll tell you this. The man overreaches. He always has. And men who overreach eventually give you an opening if you're patient enough to wait for it." He left an hour later, his hired man clicking the horses forward without ceremony. Rhett stood at the porch railing and watched them go. After a moment he said, "That went better than I expected." "It went about how I expected," Evelyn said. He looked at her sideways. "Is that irritating on purpose?" "A little." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him yet. He meant, 4 days before the auction, Gideon Voss moved. He didn't do it, obviously. That wasn't his style. What happened was a series of small things that individually looked like bad luck and collectively looked like a plan. The supply wagon from Bauer's operation didn't arrive with the supplemental grain order on Monday. When Rhett sent Foley to find out why, Foley came back and reported that Bauer had canceled the contract, citing an unresolvable delivery dispute that nobody at Bauer's could elaborate on when pressed. They had 30% of the grain they needed for the final pre-auction feeding week. On Tuesday morning, Santos found a section of the north pasture fence cut clean. Not broken, cut, with something sharp, at 3 posts in a row. 8 cattle had drifted through overnight. They spent 4 hours collecting them, and 2 came back with minor injuries from rough ground in the dark. On Wednesday, a man Evelyn didn't recognize rode slowly along the road that bordered Iron Creek's eastern boundary, stopped at several points to look at the cattle in the near pasture, and then rode on without speaking to anyone.
By Thursday afternoon, a story was circulating in Black Hollow that Calloway's cattle had shown symptoms of a respiratory illness and might be pulled from the auction on quarantine grounds.
Rhett heard about the rumor from the postmaster's wife, who mentioned it with genuine concern and no awareness that it was false. He came back to the ranch with that information and stood in the kitchen and was very quiet for a moment. "He's trying to quarantine us out of the auction," he said. "Yes. If the territorial livestock inspector comes out and finds anything at all, even something minor, he has grounds to delay our participation until it's cleared, which takes weeks." "Yes." Rhett turned and looked at her. His face had the particular tension of a man who has been fighting a rearguard action for so long that discovering the enemy has flanked him feels less like a surprise and more like a confirmation of something he'd been dreading. Can he actually make that happen, the inspector? The inspector's name is Walford. Do you know him? By reputation. He's not Voss's man outright, but he's not independent either. If a formal complaint is filed with enough specific detail, he's required to investigate. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, working through it. When would he come? Could be tomorrow. Could be day after. If it's day after, that's the morning of the auction. She looked at the table, then she looked up. Then we need to be ahead of it. We request the inspection ourselves. Today. We invite Walford to Iron Creek tomorrow, and we show him the herd ourselves, on our terms, before any complaint can be filed. Rhett stared at her. If he finds anything, he won't. The cattle are healthier right now than they've been all year. You know that. She held his gaze. The only way the rumor has power is if we respond to it by hiding. If we go toward it instead, we take it away from Voss before he can use it. She paused. We also need to send a message to every independent buyer attending the auction. Not a formal notice, something personal. A letter from you, specific and plain, describing the herd, describing the inspection, inviting them to verify with Walford directly if they have concerns. That's a lot of letters by tomorrow morning. Then we'd better start writing. They wrote until past midnight. Rhett drafted them. Evelyn edited. Foley copied them out in his careful, slightly oversized handwriting because he was the fastest of the three of them, and because he had a quality in his penmanship that made the letters look like they came from a place of deliberate honesty, which they did. Santos rode out before dawn to deliver to the 6 closest buyers. The ones farther out would have to receive their letters at the auction itself. Walford arrived the next morning at 10. He was a compact, careful man in his 50s who smelled of pipe tobacco and carried his authority in a clipboard rather than his posture. He went through the herd with the systematic method of a man who was doing his job correctly regardless of who had sent for him or who might be watching. He found nothing, not because nothing was there. Animals are animals, and a herd of any size will have individuals with minor issues, but because the 3 individuals with anything worth noting had been identified and documented by Evelyn in her record book already, with dates and treatments and current status recorded clearly. When Walford found one cow with slightly elevated mucus discharge and started making notes, Evelyn said, "That's number 41. She had a minor respiratory irritation 9 days ago, treated with the standard protocol. She's been cleared for 3 days. You can see the treatment log." She produced the record book. Walford looked at it for a longer time than was strictly necessary, then wrote something on his clipboard. "You've been keeping these records since when?" he asked. "Since the week I arrived, 1st of October. He looked at her, then at the record book, then back at her. "You're the woman from the Hartwell agency." "I am." He seemed to be recalibrating something. He made a final note on his clipboard, closed it, and said, "I'll file my inspection report this afternoon. Herd appears to be in adequate health for auction participation." "Adequate," Rhett repeated, with a flatness that communicated exactly what he thought of the word. Walford looked at him. "In my experience, Mr. Calloway, adequate is what I write when I don't have anything bad to say, but somebody important is watching to see what I write." He tucked the clipboard under his arm. "Your cattle will be at the auction tomorrow." He left. Rhett watched him go with the expression of a man filing away a piece of information about the world that he hadn't wanted to need. "He's telling us Voss already tried to reach him," Evelyn said. "Yeah, that's what he was telling us." The Black Hollow Autumn Livestock Auction was held in the large open yard behind Greer's Supply and Feed, which had been the traditional location for 20 years because it was central, It had good rail access for larger buyers, and Greer charged a reasonable percentage that nobody had ever successfully argued down, but nobody had ever truly objected to either. By 8 in the morning, the yard was crowded. Ranchers from across the county, buyers from as far as Laramie and Cheyenne, supply merchants, land agents, the kind of men who circled auctions like birds circling a field, watching what moved and at what price. The cattle had been brought in the previous afternoon and were penned in lots along the eastern fence, and experienced eyes moved through them with the particular quiet focus that money creates in a crowd. Evelyn arrived with Rhett and the hands on the wagon, which meant she entered the auction yard the way she'd entered Black Hollow a month ago, publicly, watched, with people forming opinions before she'd had a chance to give them information to form opinions from. Except this time, she was not arriving alone. She saw Gideon Voss within 2 minutes. He was near the center of the yard talking to a group of men she recognized from the description Rhett had given her. Harwell on his left, a heavy-set man with deliberate movements. Karp slightly behind, younger, with the alert watchfulness of someone whose job is to listen and report. Voss himself was dressed as he'd been in Black Hollow, in the expensive coat, the clean boots, the presentation of a man who understands that wealth is a performance as much as a fact. He saw her at roughly the same moment. His expression didn't change in any obvious way, but she caught the small recalibration in his posture, the slight straightening, the shift of attention, and understood that the situation had changed enough from what he'd expected to require a different response. What happened next happened in pieces, across about 30 minutes, and not in any order that was easy to follow in real time. Hartley Birch arrived at 8:30 and went directly to the Iron Creek cattle lots, where he spent 20 minutes with the animals before moving to talk to 2 other buyers Evelyn didn't know. The letters she and Rhett had written were doing some work. She could see 3 of the independent buyers consulting their copies, one of them in conversation with Santos, who had the useful quality of being able to explain things simply and without defensiveness. Then Voss made his move.
He didn't make it himself. That wasn't how he operated. What happened was that a man Evelyn hadn't seen before positioned himself near the center of the yard and began talking, loudly enough to be overheard, too quietly to be directly addressed, about the Hartwell Agency's disputed licensing status in the territory, about how Callaway's arrangement had been structured on fraudulent paperwork, about how a woman brought in under those circumstances couldn't be trusted to represent the herd's condition honestly, which called into question the inspection report, which called into question everything. It moved through the crowd quickly. She could track it by the way attention shifted, by the subtle drift of bodies, by the particular quality of a crowd that is receiving information it isn't sure what to do with. Rhett heard it. She saw him hear it. The set of his jaw, the color that came into his face. "Don't," she said quietly. I know what he's doing. Don't." She met his eyes. "Let me." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had several things in it at once, none of them easy to name, and then he stepped back. She walked to the center of the yard. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't position herself dramatically or make a gesture toward the crowd. She simply stopped in a space where people could see her and said, at a volume that carried without straining, "I'd like to address what's being said about the Hartwell Agency contract." The yard didn't go completely quiet. Auctions don't work that way. But the immediate area around her went still, and the stillness spread outward the way stillness does when it has something real at its center. Gideon Voss was watching from 30 feet away with an expression of mild patience, the expression of a man watching something he believes he can outlast. "The contract I signed with the Hartwell Agency may or may not have a licensing issue," Evelyn said. "I don't know the answer to that, and neither does anyone else here, because it hasn't been adjudicated. What I do know is that the claim was made publicly by Gideon Voss in Black Hollow before I'd been on the ground for 30 minutes. She paused. "A man who was trying to help me would have come to me privately. A man who made it the first thing he said in front of a crowd was doing it for the crowd, not for me." She let that sit. "I've been at Iron Creek Ranch for 31 days. In that time, I have kept a daily record of the herd's health, feeding schedule, and treatment history, which was reviewed yesterday by Territorial Inspector Walford and found accurate and complete." She looked toward the area where the independent buyers were clustered. "The cattle in the Iron Creek lots have been on a corrected mineral supplementation program for 3 weeks. Their condition is documented.
If anyone here wants to compare what they see in those lots today against the inspection report, I will stand next to you while you do it and answer any question you have. A pause. Then she looked directly at Gideon Voss for the first time since she'd started speaking. Mr. Voss has tried to prevent Iron Creek's participation in today's auction through a rumor about disease in the herd. That rumor prompted a formal inspection that found nothing of consequence. She kept her voice level. No heat in it. He has tried to discredit the evaluation of the herd by discrediting me. What he has not done is look at the cattle himself and make a case based on what he sees, because that is not how he operates. She let one beat pass. Anyone here who would like to judge the animals themselves, rather than the stories being told about them, is welcome to do so.
The yard was very quiet now, and then a voice from near the fence, older, flat, carrying the particular weight of someone who didn't speak often in public and therefore got listened to when they did, said, "I'd like to say something." People turned.
The man who stepped forward was nobody Evelyn recognized. He was small, gray-haired, dressed in the plain practical clothes of a working man rather than a buyer or merchant. He looked uncomfortable in front of the crowd, in the way of someone doing something they had decided they had to do, regardless of comfort. My name is Clem Adder. I worked for Hartwell Placement Agency in Rollins for 6 years as a contract clerk. He said it to the general crowd rather than to any one person, like a man giving testimony rather than having a conversation. I processed the Callaway-Ashcroft agreement in July of this year. The licensing claim that Mr. Voss has been making about the agency, I know where it came from. He paused. Mr. Voss's land agent contacted our office in August, 2 weeks after the contract was registered. The licensing question was raised by that contact, not discovered independently. I didn't say anything at the time because I needed the work. Another pause, shorter. I don't work there anymore, and I should have said it sooner. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the silence before. Gideon Voss's expression had not changed. He was too practiced for that, but something around his eyes had gone careful in a way that careful usually means worried. Hartley Birch's voice came from somewhere to Evelyn's left. I'll open the bidding on the Iron Creek lot. Hartley Birch's voice carried the way voices carry when a crowd is waiting for someone to break a silence they don't know how to break themselves. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Grover, who had been running the Black Hollow auction for 14 years and had seen most things, looked from Birch to the lot board to Voss's cluster of buyers and made a decision with his gavel that was also, in its way, a kind of statement. He called the Iron Creek lot to the floor. Harwell moved immediately. He stepped forward from Voss's group and placed a counterbid that was technically within the rules and practically a signal. The number was low enough to be insulting, placed fast enough to communicate that the floor was already controlled, the message being that anyone bidding against Voss's people was entering a space that belonged to them. It was the same move, Rhett had told her, that had worked on 3 other ranches in 2 years. The opening bid came in low. Voss's buyers counterpositioned fast. Independent buyers hesitated because they didn't know the floor was artificial, and by the time the room understood what was happening, the lot was sold at a price that left the seller short. Except Birch did not hesitate. He raised his number with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided before he arrived what he was willing to pay and was not interested in being managed out of it. The bid went up. Harwell countered, still within the script he'd been given. Birch went up again. There was a beat, maybe 4 seconds, where the yard recalibrated. Then a rancher from the north end of the county, a woman named Greta Sowell, who ran a mid-sized beef operation and who Evelyn had not met before today, placed a bid of her own. Not dramatically high, just enough to signal that she was in the room and paying attention and had made up her mind about something. Harwell looked back at Voss. The look lasted long enough to be visible. Voss's expression remained composed, but there was something in the set of his mouth that Evelyn had not seen there before. A tightness, a slight compression, the physical register of a man whose plan has encountered something it wasn't designed for and is now running the calculation of what that costs. He gave Harwell a small nod. Harwell pushed the bid higher. So did Birch. So, surprisingly, did a buyer from Cheyenne named Aldous Price, who had been standing near the water trough for the past hour, saying nothing, and whom Evelyn had written off as a spectator. He wasn't a spectator. He'd been waiting to see which way the room went, and now he'd seen it, and he went with it. The bidding ran for 11 minutes. Evelyn stood beside Rhett and watched it, and felt the particular kind of tension that isn't fear, but is close enough to fear that the body doesn't distinguish between them. Her hands were cold. She pressed them together and kept her face neutral. At the 9-minute mark, Harwell dropped out. He did it with a small gesture toward Voss, a slight open-handed movement that anyone not watching for it would have missed, and stepped back. Karp, who had never entered the bidding, drifted to Harwell's shoulder and said something quietly. Both of them looked at Voss. Voss did not move to bid himself. That wasn't something he did publicly. What he did instead was turn and walk toward the far end of the yard with the measured pace of a man choosing the direction of his exit carefully. Harwell and Karp fell in behind him. 2 other men from his cluster followed. By the time Grover's gavel came down on the Iron Creek lot, Gideon Voss was no longer visible in the auction yard. The number on the board was 41% higher than Rhett's debt. Rhett stood very still when Grover called it. Evelyn heard the breath go out of him. Not a gasp, not a sound of relief exactly, more the sound of something that has been held under pressure for a very long time, releasing all at once into open air. She didn't say anything. She put her hand briefly on his arm, just for a second, and then took it away because that was all the moment needed, and all she could offer without it meaning more than she was ready to say out loud. Santos said quietly, from behind them both. That's it. Decker, standing at the fence where he'd been for the entire bidding, turned away from the lot board and started walking back toward the cattle pens without a word. She caught his face as he turned. He was not a man who showed much, but there was something in it, around the eyes, in the deep lines beside his mouth, that she recognized as the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight long enough to forget it was a weight, and has only just felt it lift. The practical business of the auction took the rest of the day. There were receipts and transport arrangements and conversations with buyers about delivery schedules and the settlement of Rhett's account with the bank, which required 2 separate trips to the bank's representative, who was present specifically because auctions were where frontier debts got settled, and he needed to be there when they did. The bankman's name was Osborne, and he had the slightly pained expression of someone who had prepared himself for a difficult negotiation and was now recalibrating to a straightforward one. "You're paying in full?" Osborne said, looking at the settlement figure Rhett had written on a slip of paper. "In full," Rhett said, "plus the interest through March as contracted." Osborne looked at the paper for a moment longer than necessary. Yes, that satisfies the note completely." He paused. "I should tell you, Mr. Calloway, that I received a communication last week from a party interested in acquiring the Iron Creek property if the note went to default." Rhett looked at him. "Did you?" "I'm not disclosing who the party was, but I want you to know I considered the communication and did not act on it, because a note in good standing is a note in good standing regardless of outside interest." Osborne folded the paper carefully. "I'll have the release document to you by the end of the week." Rhett nodded and walked away without commenting on the communication or the party behind it. Evelyn, walking beside him, waited until they were out of Osborne's hearing. "You're not going to say anything about that?" "What would I say? He didn't do anything wrong. He's telling me someone tried to use my debt against me and he didn't play along." Rhett glanced at her. "That's worth knowing. It doesn't need a speech." She considered this. Most people would be angrier. Most people haven't spent 4 years being angry at things they can't change. He said it without bitterness, more like a man reporting the results of an experiment he'd run on himself. "I've gotten better at deciding what deserves it." By late afternoon, the auction yard had thinned to the last transactions, and the people who had nowhere particular to be. The November light was going early, the way it does in that part of the territory, dropping fast behind the western ridge and leaving the sky a cold, clean orange above the dark line of hills. Foley found Evelyn near the water trough, where she'd stopped to let her feet rest for the first time since early morning. "Clem Adder," he said. "I talked to him." She looked up. "How is he?" "Nervous?" "He said he's been holding that for 2 months and he's glad it's out." A pause. "He said Voss's land agent came to the agency the week after the Callaway contract was registered and told them there would be complications if they didn't find grounds to void it. The licensing question was something the agent manufactured by filing a spurious complaint with the Territorial Records Office. It was never a real issue." "Can Adder prove that?" "He kept copies. He said he doesn't know exactly why he kept them. Habit, maybe, or some part of him that knew he'd need them eventually. Foley paused again. He wants to give them to you. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Where is he? Sitting over by the east gate. I told him to wait. She found Clem Adder exactly where Foley had said, a small gray-haired man sitting on an upended feed crate with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly in a circle the way people turn things when they're thinking through whether they've done the right thing. He looked up when she approached and had the expression of someone who is already committed to something and is past the point where reconsidering would help. Miss Ashcroft, he said. Mr. Adder. She sat on the edge of the fence rail across from him. You didn't have to speak today. I know. He kept turning the hat. I've told myself that for 2 months. It got harder to believe. Foley says you kept copies of the correspondence. He reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope, held it for a moment before handing it to her. There are 3 letters in there. The original inquiry from Voss's agent, my supervisor's response, and a follow-up that makes it pretty clear what the arrangement was. He paused. I don't know what you plan to do with them. Right now I'm going to keep them somewhere safe, she said. What happens after that probably depends on a few things. He nodded like someone who had expected exactly that answer and was at peace with it. I should have come forward before today. I kept thinking it wasn't my problem, that you'd leave or the whole thing would resolve on its own. He looked at the hat in his hands. I watched from the platform in Black Hollow when you arrived. I saw what he did. She looked at him steadily. I was in the crowd, he said. I know, she said. I saw a lot of faces that day. I laughed. He said it flatly, without softening it. I laughed because everyone else did, and I didn't want to be the one person not laughing. He stopped turning the hat. That's a poor reason. She didn't tell him it was fine or that she'd forgotten or any of the other things people say to smooth over admissions that are meant to be uncomfortable. It was a poor reason, she agreed, and you did something about it today. Those aren't the same thing, but they're also not nothing. He looked up at her. Something in his face settled slightly, not into relief exactly, but into the calmer place that's on the other side of relief, where a person has done what they needed to do and can stop carrying it. Rhett found her an hour later, standing at the Iron Creek cattle pens watching the animals load for transport home. The auction had taken the bulk of the sellable herd, 58 head in the end, with the remaining 5 to follow in the next sales cycle once they'd finished their recovery. Atticus had not been sold. Rhett had fielded 2 inquiries about the bull during the auction and turned them both down without consulting Evelyn, which she found out about later and appreciated in a specific way she didn't immediately have words for. How'd it go with Adder? Rhett asked. She handed him the envelope. He opened it and read the 3 letters in the fading light, slowly, reading each one fully before moving to the next the way careful readers do with things that matter. When he finished, he folded them and put them back in the envelope and held it for a moment. He manufactured the licensing complaint, Rhett said. His agent did, on his instruction. That's fraud. Against the agency, against the Territorial Records Office, against us. Yes. He looked at the envelope. I could take this to the Territorial Marshal. You could. It might not go anywhere. Voss has enough connections that a complaint could get buried. It might, she said, but he doesn't know what we have, and not knowing is its own kind of pressure. Rhett looked at her. You think just having the evidence is enough? I think Voss built his operation on other people not being able to compare notes. Today, some of those people compared notes in public, in front of buyers who now have a reason to think twice about how they've been doing business with him. She paused. The marshal is worth trying, but the real damage to Voss today wasn't legal. It was informational. Everyone in that yard saw Birch bid against his buyers and win. Everyone saw Sowell and Price get in the room. Everyone heard Adder. She watched a calf navigate the loading ramp with the stiff-legged caution of a young animal being asked to do something unfamiliar. The machine he built works because people don't talk to each other. Today they talked. Bishi, yeah. Rhett was quiet for a while. The loading went on around them, Santos directing, Foley on the far side of the pen, Decker at the ramp doing the job he always did, methodically and without fuss. Greta Soul came and found me after the bidding, Rhett said. Evelyn looked at him. She runs about 200 head north of the ridge. She said she's been trying to sell at auction for 2 seasons, and Voss's buyers have controlled the floor against her both times. He paused. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to talk to a few other ranchers about coordinating lot presentation next season. Coming in together rather than separately, so the independent buyers have more to look at before Voss's people can set the tone. What did you tell her? I told her I'd think about it. He glanced at her. I was thinking I'd ask what you thought first. She looked at the loading ramp, at the cattle moving steadily up and into the transport wagon, at the last of the November light pulling itself off the tops of the hills. I think, she said slowly, that Voss has spent 2 years treating ranchers like they're isolated problems he can solve one at a time. The reason that worked is because they were isolated. She paused. Coordinating lot presentation is a practical thing. It's not confrontational, it's not illegal, it's just ranchers deciding to show up in the same place together. That's what I thought too. Then I think you should tell Greta Sowell yes. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had already decided and wanted confirmation from someone he trusted, which was its own kind of information. The last of the cattle were loaded as dark settled properly over the auction yard. Grover was sweeping the platform, the supply merchants were closing their stalls, the last buyers were making their final exchanges by lamplight. The yard was losing its daytime character and becoming the quieter, emptier thing it was for the other 364 days of the year. Decker came and stood beside Rhett without ceremony. He looked at the empty pen for a moment. Good price, he said. Good price, Rhett agreed. Decker looked sideways at Evelyn, briefly, in the way he looked at things he had reconsidered but wasn't going to make a formal announcement about. Cattle were in better shape than I thought they'd get in the time we had. They had good care, Evelyn said. Yeah. A pause. Foley's turning into something. He is. He's still slow. He'll speed up. Decker made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't disagreement either, and then walked off toward the wagon, which was as close to a benediction as she was likely to get from him, and she knew it. Foley materialized at her elbow. Are we going home? We're going home, she said. What? The ride back to Iron Creek was quieter than the ride to town had been, which was the natural reversal. Outbound, there had been the particular tension of people traveling towards something uncertain. Inbound, there was the different, somewhat exhausted quality of people who have been through something and are still processing what it was. Foley fell asleep against the side of the wagon within 20 minutes, in the immediate way of someone 17 whose body makes its own decisions about rest. Santos drove. Decker sat in the wagon bed and looked at the night country going past with the expression of a man who was content to be heading in the right direction. Rhett sat on the bench beside Santos, and Evelyn sat beside Rhett, and the road unspooled in the lamplight, and neither of them talked for a long time. Eventually, Rhett said, I've been thinking about the adder letters. What about them? I don't want to just hold them as leverage. That feels like, he paused, working out what it felt like doing what Voss does, using something you have against someone to keep them in a certain position. She thought about this. Filing with the marshal isn't leverage, it's accountability. There's a difference. Leverage is private. You use it to get something from the person you're holding it over. Accountability is public. You put the information where it can be evaluated by someone with authority to act on it, and then it's out of your hands. She paused. With leverage, you're still in a transaction with Voss. With accountability, you're not. He was quiet for a while. I'd rather not be in a transaction with Voss, he said. Then file the letters. Yeah, he exhaled. Yeah, I'll file them. The wagon went over the Ridgeline Creek crossing, where the water was low and running clear over the stones, and the sound of it came up through the boards for a moment, and then was gone. The North Ridge was a dark shape against a sky full of more stars than the town ever showed, and the air had the particular cold, clean smell of high country in November, the smell of a season getting serious about itself. I owe you something, Rhett said. He said it the way he said most things, carefully, without looking at her, as if the words needed to go somewhere other than directly into another person's face. You don't owe me anything. That's not true. He paused. When you got off that stage in Black Hollow, I should have been at the post office. I should have been there before the stage even arrived. I should have told Voss to take his speech somewhere else and walked you straight to the wagon without letting any of that happen. Another pause. I didn't because I was embarrassed. About the ranch, about the situation, about what you were walking into. I stood at the livery and let it go on because I didn't know what to do, and that's not a good reason. She listened to this without interrupting. I'm sorry for that, he said. It was the wrong call, and I've thought about it every day since. She looked at the road ahead for a moment. You came toward it eventually. Eventually isn't good enough for something like that. No, she agreed, it isn't. She let that sit. But it's what happened, and what happened after it is also what happened. She turned to look at him, though in the dark the look was mostly a gesture in the direction of his profile. I didn't stay because you apologized or because the situation got easier. I stayed because Iron Creek is worth staying for, and because… She stopped. Because what? She thought about how to say the next part without it being more than she meant, which was the problem with honest things. They had a tendency to expand on you if you weren't precise. Because I think you're a decent man who had a very bad year and made some mistakes and didn't quit, she said finally. That's worth something to me. He didn't respond immediately. The wagon moved on through the dark. That might be the most careful compliment anyone's ever given me, he said. It was intended carefully. A beat. I'll take it, he said. The lights of the Iron Creek ranch house appeared ahead through the dark, the kitchen window warm and yellow, where Santos had left a lamp burning before they'd left that morning. The barn was a dark shape beside it. The pastures spread out beyond in the starlight. The whole operation sitting quiet and intact at the end of a day that could have gone a number of different ways and had gone this one. Evelyn looked at it as the wagon pulled into the yard. She looked at the kitchen light, at the roof of the house, at the far pasture fence that she and Foley had fixed 3 weeks ago, and that was still holding, and she felt the particular thing that happens when a place stops being somewhere you've arrived and starts being somewhere you've stayed long enough to know the specific quality of its darkness. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard for a moment while the others moved around her with the purposeful routines of people who have been away all day and are returning to their proper work. Santos unhitching the horses, Decker heading to the bunkhouse, Foley still half asleep, navigating by instinct. Rhett stood on the other side of the wagon and looked across it at her. I'll put the lamp out in the barn, he said. There's coffee on the stove if you want it. I'll put the coffee on, she said. He nodded and turned toward the barn, and she turned toward the house, and the yard went about its quiet business around them. And somewhere in the north pasture a cow called once into the cold night air, and then was silent. The ranch was still standing. It was more than standing. It was different from what it had been, and the difference had a direction to it now, which was more than it had had on the morning she'd arrived. She went inside and lit the stove and put the water on and stood in the kitchen in the particular piece of a place that has survived something. It wasn't sure it could survive. The lamp throwing its small, steady light against the walls, the cold keeping its distance outside. She thought about Gideon Voss, somewhere across the county tonight, reworking a plan that had come apart publicly in front of every person it was designed to impress. She thought about Clem Adder and his 3 letters and the 2 months he'd spent carrying them. She thought about 63 cattle that had come in looking like what they were, animals that had been cared for properly by people who had not given up on them. The water began to heat. Outside, the North Ridge stood against the stars, and below it the Iron Creek pastures held their ground in the dark. And for the first time in a long time, the place felt like it belonged to the people living on it, rather than to the debt and the doubt and the weight of everything that had been trying to take it from them. The Territorial Marshal's office in Casper took 11 days to respond to Rhett's letter. When the response came, it was not the dismissal he'd half expected and Evelyn had quietly prepared him for. It was a single-page, official letterhead signed by a deputy marshal named Hargrove, stating that the correspondence regarding Gideon Voss and the Hartwell Agency licensing complaint had been received and forwarded to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review. It also noted, in the careful language of a bureaucrat choosing words with awareness that they might be read by more than one pair of eyes, that similar complaints regarding Voss's land acquisition practices had been received from 2 other parties in the past 18 months, and that the current submission would be considered as part of a broader inquiry. Rhett read it twice, handed it to Evelyn, and said nothing for a moment. 2 other parties, she said. He's done this before. The same thing, or close enough to it. That's what Birch said at the auction, that he overreaches. She set the letter on the table. He's been doing it long enough that the pattern is visible. He just didn't think anyone would compare notes. Will anything come of it? She considered giving him the hopeful answer and decided against it. I don't know. Territorial legal processes move slowly, and Voss has connections in Casper that will make any investigation complicated. But the inquiry existing at all, that changes something. She paused. He can't operate the same way he has been while there's an open inquiry on his practices. Every move he makes now has a witness it didn't have before. Rhett folded the letter and put it in the tin box on the kitchen shelf where he kept the ranch's important documents. He'd cleared space in that box 2 weeks ago, reorganizing it with a thoroughness that suggested he'd also been reorganizing something in his own thinking about the future of the place. Outside, November had finished settling into December with the particular commitment that Wyoming winter makes, not gradually, but all at once, as if the season had been waiting for permission and then acted on it overnight. The north pasture was under 6 inches of snow. The cattle were in the winter configuration Evelyn had laid out in the first week of November, rotating between the south pasture where the wind broke and the big barn on the worst nights. Atticus stood in his pen with the imperious patience of an animal that has recovered its health and its dignity and intends to let everyone know it. The ranch was not transformed. That was the important thing to understand, and Evelyn understood it clearly enough that she was careful never to think of it in those terms. Transformation was the kind of word that came after the fact, applied by people who hadn't been present for the actual grinding daily work of change. The fence posts that went in wrong the first time and had to come out and go in again. The feeding calculations that turned out to be slightly off and had to be adjusted. The week in mid-November when 3 calves got respiratory illness from a cold snap, nobody had predicted, and she and Foley spent 4 nights in the barn keeping them warm and watching them through the worst of it. 2 of the 3 calves recovered fully. The third recovered partially, which meant it would not be an auction animal, but would be useful in other ways. That was what real improvement looked like. Mostly better, sometimes sideways, occasionally still bad, but trending in a direction that the people working in it could feel even when they couldn't yet measure it. Greta Sowell came to Iron Creek in the first week of December. She came with a woman named Pauline Marsh, who ran a small cattle operation east of the ridge and had been at the autumn auction, though Evelyn hadn't spoken to her directly. They arrived in Sowell's wagon on a Tuesday afternoon, practical and direct, in the way of people who have driven a long way to get somewhere and aren't interested in wasting the trip. Evelyn put coffee on, and they sat at the kitchen table. The table that had become, over the past 2 months, the place where the serious business of Iron Creek happened, and Sowell laid out what she'd been thinking since the auction. 7 ranches, she said. That's how many I've talked to in the past 3 weeks who've had trouble with Voss's buyers controlling the floor. Some of them have been dealing with it for 3 years and didn't know that's what it was. They just thought they were having bad seasons. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. If those 7 ranches coordinate lot presentation next autumn, come in together, establish contact with independent buyers before the auction, share information about herd condition and pricing expectations, Voss's people can't control the floor the same way. What do you need from us? Rhett asked. Your name, mostly, and hers. Sowell looked at Evelyn directly. What happened at the auction? Adder coming forward, the way the bidding went? People are talking about it differently than I expected. Not just as a story about one ranch having a good day, as something that showed what's possible when someone doesn't back down. She paused. Your name carries something right now. I'd rather use it before the moment passes. Evelyn looked at her coffee. She had not thought of herself since arriving at Iron Creek as someone whose name carried anything in this territory. She'd thought of herself as someone doing work that needed doing, in a place that needed someone to do it, for reasons that were practical and personal in roughly equal measure. The idea that the way she'd stood in that auction yard had become something other people were measuring themselves against was uncomfortable in a way she didn't immediately know what to do with. What would coordinating actually look like, she asked. In practical terms? Pauline Marsh, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward slightly. She was younger than Sowell, with the watchful quality of someone who processes things carefully before speaking. We've been thinking about a pre-auction meeting. Ranchers only, no buyers present. Share herd numbers, general condition, expected pricing. Establish who the independent buyers are, and make personal contact before auction day. She paused. It's not complicated. It's just communication that Voss has been counting on us not having. He's been counting on isolation, Evelyn said, half to herself. Yes, Sowell said, and isolation is only a strategy against people who don't realize they're isolated. Rhett looked at Evelyn. She knew the look by now. It was the one that meant he had an opinion, but was genuinely interested in hers before committing to his own, which was a quality she'd come to value more than she'd expected to. Yes, she said, we'll be part of it. Sowell nodded once, with the efficiency of someone crossing an item off a list they've been working through methodically. Good. I'll be in touch in the spring when we start organizing properly. They stayed for another hour, talking through the ranches that had agreed and the one Sowell was still trying to reach, and by the time they left, the afternoon light was already thinning toward the early dark of December. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched Sowell's wagon move down the road and thought about 7 ranches becoming 8, and 8 becoming something that didn't have a clean number yet. The adder letters, as they came to be known informally in the ranch's kitchen, though nobody called them that outside the property, had an effect that moved more slowly than Evelyn had expected and more thoroughly than Rhett had hoped for. The territorial attorney's inquiry opened formally in January. Voss retained legal representation in Casper, and the process took on the particular quality of legal processes in which one party has more resources than the other. Slow, procedural, frequently frustrating, advancing and retreating in ways that had little to do with the underlying facts, and a great deal to do with who had the patience to stay in it longer. But things moved in the margins in the meantime. Bauer, the hay supplier who had canceled Rhett's contract in October, sent a letter in December offering to reinstate it. He did not explain the cancellation or the reinstatement, which was itself an explanation of sorts. Rhett wrote back accepting the reinstated contract and asking for a price review, which Bauer agreed to. The new price was better than the old one. Harwell, one of Voss's buyers, the one who had opened the floor bidding at the autumn auction, was seen in January having a very long and apparently unpleasant conversation with a man outside the Casper Land Registry office. The specific content of that conversation was not known. What was known was that within 2 weeks of it, Harwell had severed his formal business relationship with Voss's operation and had moved to Laramie to work independently. He told people who asked that he was looking for new opportunities, which was the kind of answer that communicated something without saying it. Voss himself was quieter, not absent. He was still in the territory, still running his operation, still the largest single landowner in the county. But the particular expansive quality he'd had, the way he'd occupied public space like a man who knew the room belonged to him, had contracted somewhat. He still had his connections and his land and his money. What he didn't have anymore, in any room where people had been at the Black Hollow autumn auction, was the implicit certainty that nobody would speak against him. That was not nothing. In fact, on the frontier where most of what people had to rely on was each other's willingness to stay quiet about certain things. It was quite a lot. December moved into January into February. The ranch developed its own winter rhythms, which were different from the rhythms of other seasons in that they had more interior time, more evenings in the kitchen with the stove working hard, more conversations that had the leisure to go somewhere rather than stopping where the work stopped. Foley was reading the veterinary reference book he'd stopped pretending he didn't own, and Evelyn had gotten him 2 additional texts from the lending library in Black Hollow through the mail order system that the librarian, a precise woman named Mrs. Calder, who took the responsibility of providing reading material seriously, had set up specifically for ranchers who couldn't come to town often. Decker, somewhere between November and January, had become a different version of himself around Evelyn. Not warmer, exactly. Warmth was not a quality Decker was built for in any obvious way, but less braced. He stopped positioning himself at angles that created distance. He started occasionally speaking to her first, which in the grammar of their dynamic meant considerably more than it would have meant with anyone else. One February morning, he came into the kitchen while she was going over the spring grazing plan on the table and sat down across from her with his coffee and said, without any particular lead-in, "My wife used to make those calculations." She looked up. He was looking at this grazing plan rather than at her. She died in 71. Fever. We had a smaller operation then, over near Laramie. He drank his coffee. She was the one who understood the land. I understood the cattle. Between us, we had most of what you need. He paused. I've been doing both since then. Not as well as either of us did them together. Evelyn didn't rush to fill the space after this. It didn't need filling. After a moment, she said, "You've kept this operation from falling apart for 4 years with 3 men and a bad stretch of luck. That's not nothing, Decker." He made a sound. "It's not," she said. "I've seen what it looks like when someone stops caring. This place doesn't look like that. It looks like someone who kept caring even when it was hard to justify." He was quiet for another moment. Then, "You're good at the land part. I learned from my father and from paying attention." "What happened to your father's operation?" "He got sick when I was 15. I ran it until I was 19. Then we sold it when he couldn't work at all. The money went to his care." She said it the same way she always said it, plainly, without the particular kind of damage that comes from treating an old wound like a fresh one. "He died the following year. I've been finding my own way since then." Decker nodded slowly. "That's a long time to be finding your way." 15 years, she said. "I got here." He looked at the grazing plan again. The south pasture section near the creek bend. If you move the rotation start 2 weeks earlier than what you've got marked, you get better ground before the heat dries the upper section. She looked at the plan. He was right. She moved the notation. Rhett asked her to walk the upper boundary line with him in the 3rd week of February, when the snow had lightened enough that the fence posts were visible again and a proper inspection could be done on foot. They walked it over the course of most of a morning, checking tension and post stability, marking the sections that needed work before spring. The work was practical and not particularly scenic. Wyoming fence line in February is nobody's idea of beautiful country, but there was a particular quality to working alongside someone in cold, clear air that creates a different kind of conversation than kitchen table conversation. More direct somehow. Fewer places to put things down and pick them up again later. They were at the northeast corner where the fence turned and ran down toward the creek, when Rhett stopped and stood for a moment looking at the line of posts running south. "I've been thinking about the operation," he said. "What about it?" "How it's structured, the ownership, the decision-making." He kept looking at the fence line. "Right now it's my name on everything. The deed, the bank account, the auction registration." A pause. "That's not accurate anymore." "To the situation." She was quiet, waiting. "I've been talking to a man in town about how to structure a legal partnership. Not employment, a real partnership. Shared ownership, shared decision-making authority, shared liability." He finally turned and looked at her. "I want to put your name on Iron Creek. Not as a courtesy, and not because of whatever the Hartwell contract does or doesn't say, because this place is as much yours as it is mine now, and acting like it isn't would be dishonest." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning she'd arrived and stood on the platform in Black Hollow while people laughed. She thought about the trunk with 2 different kinds of rope around it. She thought about the first morning in the kitchen, making coffee before anyone else was awake, looking out at a yard that was not hers and a set of problems that were not hers, and making the decision to treat them as hers anyway. She thought about what it meant to be offered the thing you had already chosen to act as if you had, and to have the offer made not from obligation, but from the honest assessment of someone who had been watching you work and had drawn an accurate conclusion. "That's a serious offer," she said. "It's a serious offer," he agreed. "I've thought about it for a while." "What does the partnership look like practically?" "Equal shares? Equal authority on decisions above a certain financial threshold. I'm thinking anything above what we'd spend on a normal month's operations, we both agree on before moving forward. You keep the accounting, I keep the field operations. Overlap wherever it makes sense." He paused. "Santos and Decker and Foley stay as employees, but we tell them what's changed. They should know. They'll have questions." "I imagine Decker's going to be annoyed that we didn't do it sooner," Rhett said, with the closest thing to dry humor she'd ever heard from him. She looked out across the northeast pasture, at the snow on the ground and the pale winter sky above the ridge and the fence line they'd just walked together. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "I accept." He nodded, and something in his face had the quality of something that has been held carefully for a long time being allowed to settle. Not joy, exactly. More like rightness, the specific feeling of a thing finally occupying its correct position. I'll finish the paperwork with the lawyer this week, he said. Good. They stood for another moment, both looking at the fence line, both in the particular company of two people who have just agreed to something that will be harder than they've said and more important than they've admitted and entirely worth it. Then Evelyn said, "The post at the second corner needs a new anchor rod. The one there is corroded." I saw that. "We should do it before the spring thaw softens the ground." "We'll do it Saturday." They turned and walked back toward the ranch, and the cold came down off the ridge behind them, and the fence held in all the places they'd checked. And the places it didn't hold yet were marked and known and had a plan attached to them. The partnership papers were signed on a Friday in early March, in the office of a lawyer named Tibbs, whose practice occupied 2 rooms above the Black Hollow feed store. Tibbs was thorough and slightly formal in the way of small-town lawyers who take professional seriousness as a substitute for the grandeur of larger practices, and he read through every clause with both of them present before anyone signed anything. At the end of it, Evelyn Ashcroft's name was on the deed to Iron Creek Ranch alongside Rhett Calloway's. Equal shares, equal standing. The document said so in language that was, by the standards of Tibbs's drafting, entirely unambiguous. She looked at her name on the deed for a moment after signing. She had owned things before: her labor, her knowledge, the small accumulation of practical skills that had gotten her from Lawrence, Kansas to Black Hollow, Wyoming, without breaking. She had never owned land. It felt different than she'd expected. Not larger, more specific, more like a responsibility than a prize, which was probably the accurate way to feel about it. Rhett signed without ceremony. Then he rolled the document carefully and handed it to Tibbs for official registration, and they walked out into a March afternoon that was cold but contained, underneath the cold, the first tentative suggestion that the season was thinking about turning. They walked to the wagon without talking. At the wagon, Rhett said, "I thought we'd go by the ranch gate on the way back. There's something I want to show you." She got in the wagon. He drove them out of town on the road she'd come in on 5 months ago. The same road, the same scrub grass and cottonwood creek beds, the same tableland under the same kind of sky, except that all of it looked different now because she'd been here long enough to see the specific character of the place, where the drainage ran, where the wind came from, where the grass came back first in spring. They pulled up at the Iron Creek gate. She saw it immediately. The gate itself was the same gate, iron post and rail, functional and unadorned. What was different was the sign above it. The old sign had been a single plank with Iron Creek Ranch burned into the wood in letters that had faded over the years to the color of old pewter. That sign was still there. Beside it, mounted to the same post, was a new plank. Same wood, same proportions, same burning technique. She could tell it had been done carefully, probably over several evenings. It read, "Calloway and Ashcroft." She looked at it for a long moment. "Decker did the lettering," Rhett said. "He asked if he could." I said yes. She pressed her lips together, not to stop from saying something, but because something had risen in her chest that needed a moment to settle before she trusted herself to speak around it. Decker had done the lettering. Decker, who had stood at the livery in Black Hollow on the day she arrived and given her the assessing look of a man deciding she wasn't worth the trouble. Decker, who had told her she wasn't what he expected, and meant it as close to a compliment as he could manage. Decker, who had told her about his wife on a February morning over coffee, and then gone straight back to work without making anything of it. Decker, who had burned her name into a piece of wood and put it on the gate of the ranch he'd kept alive through 4 bad years, as if it had always belonged there. "He didn't say anything to me about it," she said. "He wouldn't." A pause. "He told me he thought it was the right thing. That's the most Decker ever says about anything." She looked at the sign for another moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and took out the small folded piece of paper that she'd been carrying for 5 months. It had been folded so many times that the creases were soft as cloth, and the ink along the bottom edge had worn faint, but the words at the top were still legible. The tag that had been attached to her contract when she'd first opened the envelope from the Hartwell agency, in the handwriting of someone at Voss's land operation who had added it as a final small cruelty before forwarding the paperwork. 3 words. Worthless. Return immediately. She didn't unfold it. She'd stopped needing to read it sometime in November. She walked to the gatepost and found the small gap between the post casing and the base. A space just wide enough to tuck something flat. She slid the folded paper in. It fit exactly. Rhett watched her without asking.
I'm not keeping it because I need to remember it, she said. I'm keeping it because, she thought for a moment, because the only real answer to something like that is the thing that happens after it. And I want it to stay near the gate so that every time I come through here, I know that the thing after it is what I'm walking toward. He was quiet for a moment. That makes sense to me, he said. It might not make sense to anyone else. It doesn't need to make sense to anyone else.
She looked at the sign one more time. Calloway and Ashcroft. Her name in Decker's careful lettering burned into wood with the permanence of something that was meant to stay. They got back in the wagon and drove through the gate and onto the ranch. Spring came the way springs come in Wyoming, incompletely, with setbacks, through a negotiation between the season that was leaving and the one that wanted to arrive that sometimes lasted weeks longer than seemed reasonable. There were warm days in late March, followed by snow in early April. There was a week of genuine warmth in mid-April that made everyone on the ranch begin to feel differently about the year, followed by a cold snap that reminded them the year was not finished having opinions about itself. Through it all, the work continued because ranch work has no relationship with the weather except to be shaped by it and to continue regardless. The spring grazing plan Evelyn had spent February working out went into operation in the first week of April. The rotation timing Decker had suggested, starting the South Creek Bend section 2 weeks earlier than her original mark, proved exactly right. The grass came in well there, and the cattle that had spent the winter on supplemental feeding moved into it with the focused enthusiasm of animals that had been waiting for something real. Atticus, turned out into the spring pasture for the first time since the previous summer, stood at the gate of his pen for a full 30 seconds before walking out, as if considering whether the proposition was serious. Then he walked out with a dignity that the entire yard seemed to pause to observe. Foley said, "He acts like he knows we almost lost him." "He probably does," Evelyn said. "Animals understand more about their own condition than we give them credit for."
Do you think he's grateful? She thought about this. I think he's here. That's enough. Foley looked at the bull moving through the spring pasture with the recovered confidence of a healthy Hereford in good grass. I wrote to my father, he said, without particular segue. She looked at him. "Last month. I didn't hear back yet." He shrugged, in the complicated way of someone for whom shrugging is a technique for managing something larger than the gesture suggests. "I don't know if I will, but I thought you said once that the shame would be in not learning. I figured that applies to more than cattle." She didn't make a large thing of this. "It does," she said. "Yeah." He watched Atticus for another moment. "If he writes back, I don't know what I'll say." "You'll know when you have the letter in front of you." He nodded. The practical faith of that seemed to reach him in some way. In May, Greta Sowell organized the first formal meeting of the coordinated ranching group. 7 operations in the end, sitting around a table in the back room of the Black Hollow feed store with a territorial map and a working list of independent buyers, and a shared understanding that what they were doing had value precisely because it was ordinary. Not confrontational, not political in any dramatic sense. Just ranchers choosing to have information before they needed it rather than after, which turned out to be most of what coordination means in practice. Evelyn presented the Iron Creek approach to buyer relations, the pre-auction contact, the transparent herd documentation, the practice of inviting independent buyers to inspect before the formal auction rather than leaving first impressions to the floor. It was not a complicated presentation. Several ranchers around the table had questions that were really objections in question form, which she answered directly without defending against the objection underneath. At the end of it, a rancher named Percy Webb, who ran a large beef operation south of the county line and who had been skeptical enough at the start of the meeting to make it visible, said, "You think this is actually going to change how Voss operates?" "No," she said. "I think it's going to change how we operate, which is the part we can actually control." Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, the particular nod of a man who has been waiting for someone to say a sensible thing and has just heard it. The meeting lasted 3 hours and ended with a working structure, a preliminary contact list, and a date for a pre-auction gathering in September. Nothing dramatic happened. That was, Evelyn thought on the ride back to Iron Creek, exactly what made it meaningful. The dramatic things, the moment in the auction yard, Adder's testimony, Bert
Birch's opening bid. Those were the moments that broke the existing situation open. What filled the space afterward was this: ordinary people doing ordinary things better than they'd been doing them, steadily, without expecting it to be more than it was.
Yeah.
It was June when Rhett asked her to walk with him in the evening, not for any stated purpose, just to walk, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. They went out along the south pasture fence at the end of the day, when the light was long and gold, and the cattle were settling for the night, and the whole ranch had the particular quality of a place at rest after work. The ridge to the north was dark against the sky. The creek was running full with snowmelt from the mountains, a sound that was always in the background at this time of year, steady and purposeful. They walked for a while without talking. Then Rhett said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there's no obligation attached to it, and I'm not asking because of the partnership or the situation or any practical reason." She waited. "I'd like to court you," he said. He said it plainly, without embellishment, looking at the pasture rather than at her, which she had long since recognized as his way of saying the things that were most serious. "Not as the arrangement that brought you here. Not as anything that was set up or agreed to in a contract. As myself, asking you, because I want to." He paused. "You don't have to answer now." She looked at the long light on the pasture and thought about the question with the same honest care she brought to everything that mattered. The truthful answer was that she had been aware of the change in herself since sometime around December. The specific shift that happens when a person moves from deciding to stay somewhere to genuinely belonging to it. Part of belonging to Iron Creek had become belonging to the company of this particular man who was not easy or warm or given to grand gestures, who communicated in the careful language of someone who had been alone long enough to measure every word before spending it, who had looked at her on the first day with the frank assessment of a man who needed real help and had offered her what the place had to give without pretending it was more. He was not a romantic figure in any storybook sense. He was a person who showed up every morning and did the work and said what he meant, and was honest about what he didn't know. She had found, over 7 months, that this was considerably more than it sounded like. "I don't need to think about it," she said. He turned and looked at her then. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." He didn't smile in the broad way of a man performing happiness. What happened to his face was smaller and more real than that. A kind of quiet opening, like something that had been held carefully for a long time relaxing its grip. He looked like a man who has received good news and needs a moment to determine that it's real. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They stood in the evening light for a moment and then kept walking, because that was what people do when they have settled something important and there is still ground ahead of them. The summer passed in the way that good working summers pass. Full, sometimes difficult, occasionally surprising, fundamentally forward-moving. A late June storm took down a section of the east barn roof and cost them 2 weeks of repair work and a lumber bill that strained the spring budget. Foley received a letter from his father in July, short, guarded, but present, which was what mattered, and was quiet about it for a day before becoming himself again. Santos took a week in August to visit family in New Mexico and came back with a measured, restored quality that told Evelyn the visit had done what he'd needed it to do. Decker turned 61 in August and refused to acknowledge this in any way, which the ranch respected by not acknowledging it either, except that Evelyn made the specific biscuits he liked best for breakfast that morning and left it at that. The territorial inquiry into Voss's practices was still ongoing in August, its pace unchanged by the season or anyone's impatience. There were developments: a formal deposition from Clem Adder, a subpoena for the land agency correspondence, a secondary inquiry opened by the records office into the fraudulent licensing complaint. But none of them resolved cleanly or quickly, because legal processes involving powerful men never do. What they did was continue, which was its own form of pressure and its own form of accountability. Voss was at the county land registry in August. Rhett heard from Osborne, the bankman, attempting to register an acquisition of grazing land north of the ridge. The acquisition was denied pending the outcomes of the territorial inquiry. This had not happened to Voss before, or not in recent memory. The denial sat in the air of the county with the quality of a thing that had changed the way certain things work, without anyone being able to point to the exact moment the change had occurred. The September pre-auction meeting of the Coordinated Ranching Group drew 10 operations instead of 7, which meant the original back room at the feed store was too small, and they moved to the school hall, which was available on Saturdays and smelled of chalk and old wood in a way that made the occasion feel more serious than anyone had planned for it to be. Evelyn presented the Iron Creek numbers for the upcoming auction and the documentation system she'd refined over the past year. The room had a different quality from the first meeting. People were less guarded, more willing to say what they actually thought rather than the diplomatic version of what they thought, which is what meetings become when people have been through something together, even something as quiet as a shared year of working better than they had before. Afterward, walking back to the wagon with Rhett, she said, Percy Webb offered to host the spring planning meeting at his operation. He's in. He's been in since May. He just needed to see it work one full cycle. She watched a group of the ranchers talking near the school steps. Sowell and Marsh and a man from the North County she'd been introduced to that day, talking with the easy directness of people who have decided each other are worth talking to. They'll all be at the auction next week. And Birch? Birch confirmed last Tuesday. She paused. He said to tell you the herd better be in the same condition as last year, or he's going to be significantly less agreeable. Rhett made the sound that was almost a laugh. It was easier to come from him now. Not frequent, not casual, but no longer rare enough to mark. That means he's coming. That means he's coming. The autumn auction arrived in the last week of October, the calendar having turned back to nearly the same point where the story had started, except that almost nothing was the same. The Iron Creek cattle went to the floor as a coordinated lot with 2 other ranches from the group, Sowell's operation and a smaller ranch run by a family named Duval, who had joined in August. Birch opened the bidding. 3 other independent buyers, 2 of whom had been part of the pre-auction contact process, came in quickly after him. Harwell was not there. Karp was present, but bid cautiously and without the coordinated floor setting that had characterized Voss's operation the previous year. Whether this was because Voss had pulled back in response to the inquiry, or because his buyers had grown uncertain of their own position in the machine they'd been part of, or simply because the room had changed enough that the old approach no longer worked the way it had, the reason was less important than the result. The Iron Creek lot sold at a price that was better than the previous year's already good price. Afterwards, Rhett handled the financial settlement with an efficiency that came from not being afraid of the numbers anymore, and Evelyn talked to Birch long enough to establish the terms of a continued relationship for the following year, which Birch communicated by saying almost nothing except for the specific things that mattered. On the ride home, Foley said from the wagon bed, "Same time next year." "Same time next year," Evelyn said. Decker said nothing, but he was the one driving the wagon, and he took the road home with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who knows exactly where he's going and has no objection to being the one who gets everyone there. The Iron Creek gate came into view in the late afternoon light. The new plank caught the low sun. Callaway and Ashcroft, the lettering clean and deliberate and permanent against the old wood of the post. Evelyn saw it the way she saw it every time she came through the gate, not as an arrival, but as a confirmation. A daily fact. The name that someone had decided was worthless, and the answer that had been built in the 11 months since, not with a speech or a declaration, but with mornings and fence posts and sick cattle and difficult conversations and the daily choice to stay. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require an audience. It shows up at dawn and moves the cattle and fixes the fence and writes the letters and stands in the auction yard and says what needs to be said, and then it comes home and puts the coffee on and does it again the next day. It is the courage of people who have decided that the place they are in is worth the work it costs, and who have found, in another person, the particular confirmation that they were right about that, not because that person is perfect or easy or without their own fractures and silences in places where the old damage still shows, but because they have looked honestly at each other and decided to be here anyway. Rhett held the gate open as the wagon came through. He looked at Evelyn as she passed, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because what needed to be said had been said on a fence line in February and in a lawyer's office in March, and in the sign above the gate, and in the daily fact of the ranch going on. The wagon moved through the gate and into the yard, and the late afternoon settled over Iron Creek, with the particular golden weight of a season at rest, and the cattle were in the pastures, and the fence was holding, and the name on the gate belonged to two people who had chosen it. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.